It's amazing to be here to talk about this book again. I found these letters in June 1987, and you guys can do the math, but that was a lot of years ago. The book was published in 1996, and that was, what, 17 years ago. There are members of the Halliday family here today, which thrills me to no end, because it was in the attic of Phyllis Halliday that I found these letters, and it's really her story that I worked so hard over 8 years to try to be faithful to the story that I found in that attic, which was truly an extraordinary story. So Diane and I will talk a bit about it, but I want to read just a couple of passages. And I have to say that when I sat down to sort of figure out what I was going to read, I mean, I practically started reading the whole book over again. I've written 16, I've published 16 books, but I have to say this is such an important book to me. When I was writing it, it was just me and the material. I wasn't thinking about readers, I wasn't thinking about fame and fortune, which of course are entirely elusive and never happened anyway. But it was a very pure kind of writerly experience. It was me and the material. And my work in over 8 years was to find out as much as I could about these two people and the circumstances in which they lived, and to try to tell this story in as true a way as I possibly could, while at the same time respecting it as story. So it takes place, for those of you who don't know, in 1919, October 1919. Is based on a correspondence I found in an attic, and it goes from October 1919 to July 1920. And this first excerpt is from October. The burning barrel stood halfway between the house and the shed at the back corner of the yard. On Saturday, it was Phyllis's job to burn the week's rubbish. Newspaper, red butcher's paper, letters already answered, occasionally scribblers filled with last year's lessons. This morning the air was honed with the edge of winter. Grey clouds bore down from the north, so low they threatened to snag in the bared branches of the trees. Phyllis could see her breath, white and wispy, as if a fire smoldered inside her. She pressed a shoebox into the mess in the barrel, then picked up a newspaper from the pile on the ground, twisted it into a tight taper, and lit one end with a match. She liked this chore. She liked being outside. More than that, she liked being away from the crush of family, alone and out of sight, nestled by the lilac hedge, the cedars, and the elm trees that shielded her from the wagons and motor cars that clattered toward the center of Portsmouth Village. Behind her, a dirt road extended along the back of her father's land, a thin boundary between the last house in the village and the prison quarry. Phyllis reached into the pocket of her coat and closed her fingers around the roll of paper, thin as a cigarette. Lying in her palm, backlit by the flames, it did not seem remarkable at all. Thin brown paper, striped with faint purple markings. For a week, the paper had lain first in one pocket, then another, coat to school dress, to apron, to night dress. She picked it up in curiosity, boldly hidden it for days, but she could not bear the burden of her secret any longer. Whoever he was, this convict who dropped notes by the road, she would have no part of him. When the letter touched the flame, the pages parted in the heat, opening like blossoms on a hot summer day. Words, illuminated briefly, pleaded, "Never fear, little friend, trust me," then withered and blackened. The next piece I'm going to read is from December. According to the official record, each cell in the penitentiary at Portsmouth measured 5 feet across, 9 feet long, 10 feet high. But the prisoner gauged the limits of his confinement in other ways. The prisoner's cell was as wide as his outstretched arms. Standing in the middle, he pressed his palms flat against opposing walls, his body a conduit to the cold that hunkered in the bricks on either side. It crept from the flat of his fingers, snaked through the maze of metacarpals to his wrist, up his forearm, through his biceps, into his shoulder, insinuated itself between his ribs. It came at him from both sides, pressing towards his center. The acid cold of the walls a thrilling antidote to the insistent, inescapable chill of the air. If he could hold the position long enough, he thought, he could freeze himself to death. His cell was 3 strides long. In the time it took to count 1, 2, 3, he could saunter leisurely from one end of his living quarters to the other. The slate floor was worn to a trough by almost a century of such strolls, more frequent in summer than at this time of year, when it was best to keep one's feet up off the ground. Walking to the back of the cell, the prisoner faced a brick wall inset with 2 grates, each as big as his splayed hands, one at shin height, the other above his head. Behind that wall lay the corridor where the guards patrolled, peering through the Judas slits. Across the darkness, the back of another man's cell. He knew these things as a blind man knows his neighbor's secrets, by muffled footsteps and whispered words. Walking toward the front of his cell, the prisoner faced the bars welded inside a steel door frame set into the stone. 7 cross pieces made a grid of the gate, slicing each bar into uniform sections no more than a handspan high. The bars were set far enough apart that the prisoner's whole palm slid through. He could wave his free hand in the air. The bars closest to the lock were doubled up, the space between them reduced to a finger's width. The prisoner caressed the groove at the top of a bar just under the crosspiece, a memento from one of his predecessors who'd given up in despair, or, he preferred to imagine, continued his patient filing elsewhere. The cell was as high as a prisoner could leap. Arm extended, he jumped from a low crouch, straining to graze his fingers against the plaster. Again and again he leapt. His fingers swiped the spider webs in the corner, a splatter of fly specks, the light bulb's edge. Now and then he would get up from his bunk and leap again, for the truth was that in the twilight of a sleepless night, if he stared at the ceiling long enough, it would drift away from him. And unless he reached out quickly, he feared it would slip like the face of a half-remembered lover, forever beyond his grasp. The ceiling of the prisoner's cell was white. So were the tops of the walls. From the level of his shoulders down, the brick was painted green, thick layers of enamel that shattered against the toe of his boot, the chips spanning like a single-minded rainbow from the yellowed green of mucus to the gray-green of overcooked peas. Successive applications of paint had failed to obliterate the marks that previous tenants had made, the accumulated graffiti of dozens of petty thieves, or perhaps just a handful of sophisticated felons. Numbers and dates were etched into every surface within reach, some only faint impressions, others gouged so deeply they would never be erased. The year one man came in, the date another was released, the length of a sentence, and another, spelled out in years and months, but mostly days. There were few initials. JC, after all, could be anyone. Those who devised the penitentiary system assume a man had lost his sense of self when he was stripped of his name, but in a number, a convict's immortality was assured. At Kingston Penitentiary, there had only ever been one V16, one F327. As long as the building stood, there would never again be another G852. 20 cells, each identical to the prisoners, were strung in a row to form one tier. 4 tiers of cells rose one above the other. A narrow catwalk in front of each tier overlooked a common corridor. The only source of light for the bank of 80 cells, narrow arched windows on the other side of the corridor. The only source of heat, the radiator pipes beneath the windows that carried warmth from under the earth where the boiler room stood across the yard. 4 tiers of cells made up one range, 2 ranges back to back, joined by the spy corridors behind the Judas slits, filled one cell block. 4 cell blocks radiated like the arms of a Greek cross from the vaulted tower at the center, the dome. Each double range of cells was freestanding within its block. No cell abutted an outside wall. A prisoner at Kingston Penitentiary who tunneled through the walls ended up in the spy corridor or in another man's cell. There was only one way out, through the cell door, along the catwalk to the balcony that circled the dome's interior, down the spiral of stone iron stairs past the guards. And no one entered a cell block, a range, a tier, a cell, except through the clearinghouse of the dome. For 2 years and a day, cell number 16, range 2, cell block C, was the prisoner's home. Cell, from the Latin cella, a storage closet, from cellara, to hide. The root also, according to the dictionary on his shelf, of the word cellar and conceal. Cell, a hollow receptacle, a cavity that contains, a monk's quarters, the basic structural unit of living matter. Thank you.
So, first of all, one of the very important characters in this book is, of course, Kingston Penitentiary. And as I'm sure you all know, on the 19th of April 2012, the then Minister of Public Safety, Vic Taves, announced in a public press conference the closing of Kingston Penitentiary. At the time, they said it would be closed sometime in 2014 or 2015. They're now saying that as of October 1st of this year, it will be empty. Correctional Service of Canada is not very transparent in how they are intending to do this. They haven't said really where they're going to put all these fellows. So I thought it would be interesting if Merilyn could tell us how she felt when she heard about the closing of KP. In that passage you read where you talk about home, I know that for prisoners, the prison is home. And so it's a huge emotional issue. And I also think for Kingston as well.
Well, it is. That prison was built in 1837, and it was built by convicts. It was built by those who were convicted of conspiring in the 1837 rebellion. And those men were sent to Kingston, and they built their own prison. They forged their own iron bars, which to me is just such an amazing image. Portsmouth was a tiny little village known as Hatter's Bay at the time, and part of the construction of the prison was to fill in what was a causeway. That Hatter's Bay used to extend way in where there's that park now, and so the rubble from the building of the prison was dumped there to fill in that and create the park and create the road and much shrink Hatter's Bay, which was basically a shipbuilding, and Portsmouth was a shipbuilding center at the time. So since then, since 1837, which again, those of you who are good in math can do the math, but it's a long time ago, that building has been home generally for between 500 and 700 men, and for a time also women. The prison for women was inside the walls until after 1922. I think it was 1928 when the prison for women was built. So we have these enormous structures in our town, right? And it's interesting because when KP was built, it was built in Portsmouth so that it would be away from Kingston, right? So it would be 2 miles outside of Kingston, and that would keep Kingston safe. Of course, now Kingston has expanded to embrace it, more or less. They've done, okay, so one of the things that really was important to me in writing the book was that this is where these guys live. You know, it's their home. It's not a place they're passing through. It's where they live every day of their lives for the period that they're incarcerated. And right now, as we know, KP is home only to offenders who are in solitary confinement, mostly stool pigeons and sex offenders. At the time that Josie, Daddy Longlegs, was in prison, it was a general holding federal prison. Anybody who was sentenced to more than 2 years and a day was sent there. There was no triaging of prisoners at the time, so guys like my guy who were in, he was convicted for stealing a car, and so he was sent to Burwash, which was an experiment. Does anybody know Burwash? Is it still open? I don't think it is. It was an experiment. They built this prison in the middle of the woods in northern Ontario, thinking that nobody would escape because they would escape into, hundreds of miles of wilderness. But in fact, they escaped in droves. I mean, everybody left, right? Because why would they stay? There was no walls, there were no bars. So like everybody else, he left, but he was caught. And because he was convicted of escaping from another prison, he was sent to KP. But that was a fairly minor crime. He got 2 years and a day, and he was side by side, as were everybody in that prison, were side by side with serial murderers, hardened criminals who'd been in prison for 30 years. And I did read the convict list, and there was a guy in there for stealing bread. So all of these people were all mixed up together. They weren't triaged. So this was like a big holding pen. So when I think of all the men who have lived in that prison, all the families who have moved to Portsmouth Village and to Kingston to be close to the people that they love, it's a real monument, that building. And I understand that they have to make, they want a more modern facility, and that's fine. But I worry, A, about the lives of those people being remembered, acknowledged, and especially the ones who lost their lives inside. And I think the building itself has merit. I think as one of those forbidden places, it bothers me that we forget, that our understanding of people who break the law ends in the courtroom, and we don't follow them inside the prison. We don't know what it's like for people to live inside a prison, unless, of course, you watch Orange is the New Black.
Yes.
But still, this is our Alcatraz. There are many things that can be done for the building, and I know there are many movements afoot as to whether we should keep it as a historic monument, turn it into condos, turn it into, there's a whole, maybe you guys know this, but it was a shock to me. There's a whole, I can't remember the name, I was so appalled by it. It's something like dark tourism or something, but there's a whole tourist movement where you can go and spend nights in horrible places, like concentration camps and prisons and stuff, to sort of, I guess, as some sort of weird reality experience. I find that option appalling. But I do think this prison, through the 19th century, Kipling was here, Dickens was here, everybody who came to Canada stopped in Kingston, or Upper Canada, stopped in Kingston, toured the prison, and then went on to Toronto. That was kind of the deal. It was a weird sort of tourist attraction, right? But it's part of us. It's part of this city, for sure. And it's part of thousands and thousands and thousands of people's lives.
Well, indeed. Having had a fair bit to do with the prison system myself in the last few years, the day that announcement was made, I was actually having a relationship with someone who was in prison, and I couldn't imagine what the reaction of current prisoners was going to be to that announcement. I thought, because from everything I've heard, it's a pretty hellish place still. Not a whole lot better maybe than it was in the time of this book. But that was not the reaction at all. What I heard from the guys that I knew is they felt, to quote, the mothership had gone down.
Yeah.
So for them, they had a huge emotional attachment to that place, if only because they'd been in it and survived. And so suddenly this whole part of their identity was being taken away from them. And they were really upset. So I think the place does hold a huge history, not only for Kingston and not only for people who have been in there, but I'll bet there's not a person in Canada who hasn't heard of Kingston Penitentiary. Surely it's the most famous prison in the country.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
So whatever they're going to do with it, I don't know, and chances are we'll be the last to know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's I think one of the values of the book is that I tried really hard to present the life inside the prison as best I could discover what it was, because there are very few. Well, as you know, there are prison memoirs, and the most famous being Roger Caron's, I think. But there have been memoirs, right all the way along, and there are, official stories. And actually, Stevie Cameron at this moment is writing a book about Kingston Penitentiary that will be out next year. And man, that's one we'll have at the festival for sure. But there's no record of what it was like to live inside the prison as it was being lived. These letters actually are unique in the English-speaking world. There's an odd page here and there smuggled out of a prison, but a whole correspondence that covers almost a full year. It doesn't exist. I had intended actually to continue that with one of Josie's letters, and I just love this one little part of it. Okay, it's a short letter. Kind Peggy, here I am again, and only an hour or so since I seen you. You must have come home early tonight. Was you up there very long before I appeared? I believe you are a wee bit bashful, are you? It's a very good point. I wish I was so. I've not noticed Watch around lately. Watch is her dog. What's become of him? I seen him on several occasions hiding his bones. I called him by his name once, and you should have seen the look he gave me. If he looks at me like that again, why, I'm going to steal his bones and bring them in and put them in some of the soup we get in here. Some soup. Every time we have soup, I notice Lake Ontario goes down about 12 or 14 inches. They should have a sign up. Pea soup. Find a pea, get a pardon. Perhaps you have in your experience around the quarry noted how a hole is drilled in a stone in order to blast it out. Well, this AM I was striking the drill with an 8-pound hammer, and the boy who was holding the drill was fooling and was putting his finger on top of the drill and kept saying, "Hit it, Joe, hit it, Joe." Okay, that's his other friend, was kidding me for an hour, and by accident I did hit the poor kid's finger, smashed it. Oh, I almost fainted, turned me sick. But he only laughed and would not go and tell the boss and have something done for it. I told him I would go if he didn't, so he did. Poor kid, I gave him some tobacco, and here's what he said. "Joe, I'm going to have my other hand hit as soon as this tobacco's done." He's a little Irishman, a fine fellow, in here for stealing an auto, always smiling, first thing in the morning and last thing at night. Well, Peggy, little girl, it seems a very long time since I've heard from you. I've been short of writing paper, but now I have plenty, bought a big pile while the clerk was out. I am, as before, your affectionate friend, Daddy Longlegs, Joe. I forgot to mention the letter I left. Many thanks, and trust me.
Charming fellow and very funny.
Oh, he's very funny and very optimistic, and you couldn't imagine very much ever getting him down. This fellow, who was 24 at this time of writing, had been in a prison of one sort or another since the age of 11. He was in the St. John's School for Boys near Uxbridge, just north of Uxbridge. He was put in there at the age of 11 and had been doing time of one sort or another ever since then.
Well, that kind of plays nicely into what I want to talk about next.
Oh, good.
So you think we planned that, although we hadn't. So I think it's important to remember that that's a real letter. That was not written by Merilyn. That was discovered by Merilyn. And something I discovered when I got out my copy of The Convict Lover was I had put inside of it a brown envelope. Now, not as exciting as what you found in the attic. But what I found was that I had kept a bunch of clippings and reviews that had come out at the time. And it was kind of amazing to look at them because although I remembered that there had been some controversy about the book when it was published, I had forgotten the intensity of it. And what it was all about was, is this nonfiction? Is this fiction? Is this a fictional nonfiction? There was a big upset, really, about the issue of genre. Where does this book fit? And I think now, it came out in 1996, so again, the math tells 17 years. I think we've become accustomed to and pretty comfortable with the idea of books that sort of cross between genres, roam around a bit, that are not easily defined. But at the time, it was shocking, really. And there was quite a flurry of upset about this issue. This May, I was again at another Writers Union AGM, and I was on a panel called Genre Wars. And I distinctly remember somebody saying, "Are we still talking about that?" Well, we are still talking about that, but not nearly as angrily as it was talked about then. And I think that the fact that this sort of genre bending thing is getting to be more and more okay is, I really think that The Convict Lover was a groundbreaking book in that direction. So I was hoping that maybe you could talk about that particular issue a little bit.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, it happened accidentally. I didn't set out to do anything new, particularly. I had the material, and it was really, really, really important to me to write about these real people. What astounded me about the story was that it really happened. And I wanted to preserve that for the reader to feel that same thing too, that the story really happened. So I needed to keep the real names, and I needed to keep the facts of the matter. Okay, so then where did that leave me? Okay, I did a ton of research. That was great. In the course of the research, I discovered William St. Pierre Hughes, who we haven't talked about, who was the superintendent of penitentiaries, the first one in Canada, an amazing man who set out a list of prison reforms in 1919, and they have not yet all been implemented, if you can believe it. And they started with things like not shaving their heads. They shaved their heads when they left the prison so that they would be easily identified as a convict. Letting them not wear stripes anymore. They wore great big purple stripes. Purple and mustard yellow. It was really charming. Either that or a huge houndstooth in red and gray. We didn't have the black and white stripes from television movies. So I found William St. Pierre Hughes, and that was great. That gave me 3 people, so it was a nice triangle for the book. And then I discovered that the first riot ever in Kingston Penitentiary took place during the time of those letters, as a direct result of communists being incarcerated in the prison during the Red Scare of the winter of 1919-1920. So that gave, okay, that was a good piece. In fact, that was responsible for about 50 pages that were eventually cut when I cut this book from the 750-page manuscript that I started out with and cut it down to 350 pages. So there was a lot on the cutting room floor. But okay, so I had these things, I have this research, and I mean, every decision I made was based on my first principle, which is I want to tell a true story. So I kept myself just on a really, really short leash. If it says she's wearing a green dress, it's because I found a green dress in the attic. If in one place I talk about a a bed jacket she's wearing. I talk about the Ovaltine tin where she keeps her letters. That's one of them. This is one of the cookie tins that I found. Yeah, you want to take that? Thanks. That I found in the attic. These look really familiar to you, don't they, Dorothy? But yeah. So what have I got in here? I've got pretty little things. So you know, I mean, the apron is in the book, and the camisole top is in the book. And do I have a beautiful bed jacket here? Which is okay, pantaloons. You want to see the pantaloons? Yeah, so you know, so all the and handkerchiefs. I mean, I have dozens of her handkerchiefs and the little handkerchief holder that they were in. So nothing is in the book that I didn't have some sort of physical evidence for. I got huge calendar pages and put them in the wall of my study for the 9 months of the story. And I started reading the Whig Standard, and I noted the weather every single day. And it helped me order the letters, right? Because the letters, some were, 25 pages long. They were all in pieces. They were, I had to put them back into discrete letters. Some were written on toilet paper. They were very fragile. They're all in Queen's Archives now. So in reading the Whig, it helped me order the letters, because he'd say something like, I saw my first robin today, and the Whig also always reported when somebody saw the first robin, so that would sort of, give me a time period. But more than that, it gave me other things like weather and events in the town. So when I wrote it, the part that's invention is, of course, the thoughts and the feelings of the characters, because I couldn't possibly know. I had to extrapolate. I dearly wanted to write more of her letters. I only had 4 letters from her that were on the back sides of his letters. And I would have loved to have written more letters, right? So she would have more of a voice, of her own voice. But I couldn't do that, right? How could I do that? Because then it wouldn't be true anymore. I wanted to invent a girlfriend for her, right? I wanted a foil. I wanted her to have somebody to talk to. But I couldn't do that because I couldn't find a friend. I couldn't find any evidence that she'd had a friend. And so I couldn't invent it because maybe that was really far from the truth. Maybe she was a really solitary person who kept to herself. Although there are extrapolations, like how would a mother allow her daughter to do that? To go into a quarry in the middle of the night and retrieve a letter from a convict that had money in it, and then go and buy tobacco. It was illegal then for women to buy tobacco. Get the tobacco, go back in the quarry, hide the tobacco for the fellow. She could have, I think it was a 3-year sentence for aiding and abetting a prisoner. I mean, she was at real risk. So why did her parents found out she was doing this. Why did they do that? Well, I can't know that. Nobody wrote it down. So that's the sort of thing that I had to extrapolate from everything I knew. And I knew her father was a Sunday school superintendent in the church. I knew he had letters to the editor in the paper supporting the strike. Canadian locomotive workers went out on strike in support of the Winnipeg General Strike. The Winnipeg General Strike guys went back in, 2 weeks or something. Canadian locomotive stayed out for 5 months. And he was head of the union there and was, in the negotiation. So I had a sense of the kind of people her people were. They had a religious sensibility. They had a socialist sensibility. So I extrapolated from that. I don't know if I got it right. I mean, that's what my novel, The Holding, is about. It's about somebody who finds letters and gets it completely wrong. And it's kind of my penitence in case I got, the convict lover completely wrong. But the thing is, we have so little history from ordinary humans, right? We have people throw everything out. So the little piece that fell quite literally into my lap, I felt an intense responsibility to get it right, which meant I needed to call it nonfiction. I needed to signal to people that it was true, which meant that people then went through it, you know, looking for errors, and there was one, not there wasn't one, there was one that somebody thought was an error. His father was one of the guards who's portrayed in the book, and I have the guard smoking a cigarette, and he said that couldn't be possible because his father only smoked a pipe, and he actually filed a lawsuit.
Oh yeah, I have the letter.
You have it, yeah.
I have the letter that he wrote to the Whig Standard,
yeah,
accusing Merilyn of defaming his father's character.
Right, because he was smoking. Because cigarettes were a bad thing then, and a pipe was sort of honorable.
It's not a bad thing, but it's not worth suing somebody over.
And I heard about the lawsuit. I got the phone call from my lawyer as I was, and literally while I was backstage about to go on stage for my first sort of public reading from the book with Margaret Atwood at the Vancouver Festival. We were doing an onstage conversation. It was a little unsettling. But the truth is, his father did smoke cigarettes, and I had proof of it, oddly enough. So those kinds of details I got right. The only place somebody could call me on, I think, is in the thoughts and feelings, the things I couldn't know.
But those kinds of questions and how you handle all of that, again, I think it's no longer a strange thing that you did, but at the time, people just didn't know, a lot of people, not just him, but other people didn't quite know how to read it. They wanted, I think when you go into a bookstore and it's in the fiction section, well, that's one thing, but then if it's in the nonfiction, that's another thing, and if it really should be on a table somewhere else entirely, I think people need a signal as to, oh, how should I read this? Yeah. But hopefully we're getting past that now.
I think so. This book has been shelved in women's studies, criminology, fiction, creative nonfiction. It's sort of, and I love that. Yeah. The more places, the better.
Yeah. I think bookstore people don't love that though.
No,
they don't know.
And publishers don't love it because they want to.
Yeah, they like to be able to say
it.
this book is like one thing.
Yeah.